Thank you, Matthew, and thanks to everyone. It's such a distinguished group and such a pleasure to be here. We've heard a lot about these Millennium Development Goals this morning, so I just wanted to take a bit of time to go a bit deeper on that, and even just to take stock on where we are today in March of 2008. For those who aren't familiar, these goals were set in September 2000 at the UN Millennium Summit, where world leaders came together and said, and I quote, "We will spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty to which more than 1 billion are currently subject." That set the tone and the spirit and the ambition for these Millennium Development Goals to cut extreme poverty in half by 2015. And poverty measured in terms of not just people living on less than $1 a day, but child mortality, to cut it by 2/3. Those without access to the simplest of things, clean drinking water, to cut it by half by 2015. Hunger, cut it by half. Not even all the way, but just half by 2015. 8 years later, as we heard this morning from our true global leaders on these issues, we're in a precarious state on these goals. We're at a stage now where we can take stock at the midpoint, but where we also need to be very keenly aware of the fact that plans are underway, not just for 2008 right now, but for 2009, 2010, 2011 in capitals around the world. And there's an urgent need for action. And when we look at where progress is happening and where it's not happening, our attention turns very quickly to Africa, as the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General, former Secretary General and current Deputy Secretary General said earlier today. Just to give a tidbit of how fast the world is changing, a generation ago, 1 in 10 of the world's people living on less than $1 a day were living in Asia. Or pardon me, in Africa. The bulk was in Asia. Today it's about 1 in 3 live in Africa, and we're on track for it to become 1 in 2 by 2015. So extreme poverty is increasingly and overwhelmingly a challenge of extreme poverty in Africa. This year has been described as a moment of truth for the world. There have been calls to action from world leaders, from civil society leaders, from academic leaders. And it is a moment of truth and a call to action because so many lives hinge in the balance. And because there is such a dramatic need for progress. Now that said, I think it's important to look back to how we got to where we are, because there has actually been quite a bit of progress. And there's actually been quite a bit of progress on something which I might call the art of the impossible over the past 8 years. If we look back to 2000, just to take a few examples, when these goals were set, there was basically no one in Africa on antiretroviral treatment, while millions were dying every year from AIDS. There was no global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Probably at least 500,000 children a year were dying of measles. We had school fees being charged in the vast majority of countries where children can't afford and families can't afford $8 or $10 a year. And all of these things were just considered too hard to see progress. The notion of an African Green Revolution, the notion of a country like Malawi doubling its yields in just a couple of years was seen as impossible. But each of those issues has seen incredible progress, sometimes in just a couple of years, many of them across the full 8 or 7.5 since the goals were set. We now have probably, by best estimate, about 1.5 million people on antiretroviral treatment. That was impossible. The measles target was reached to cut measles deaths by 90%, was reached 3 years ahead of schedule. 1,000 lives a day are being saved from measles that otherwise would have been lost. We have 20 million more children in school than roughly a decade ago, because of debt relief, and because of the cancellation of school fees. In Kenya, we saw literally, in countries like Tanzania and Malawi, millions of children showing up for school overnight when school fees were abolished. There is major success happening. It's just not happening at the scale that it's needed.